உலகெங்கும் தமிழரின் பிம்பம் உங்கள் டிவி.
Dear viewers, welcome to CrossRoads on TVI. The arts and culture have played an historical and immense and significant role in the development and establishment of Tamil culture. However, with the displacement of our community to many lands, new themes and forms of expression have taken place. As a result, new tensions and new ideas of what Tamil culture is have come to the forefront, requiring careful and needful retrospection and introspection. To discuss this topic, we are joined with Sudarshan Durayappa, a professor of ancient history and religion at the University of Toronto. Later in the show, we'll be joined with Satarshi Ignatius, a performer within a drama troupe within our community. Thank you, dear viewers. Please join our conversation. As always, please call us at 416-623-8100 to join in on our conversation. Welcome, Sudarshan. Thank you for making time to coming on our show.
Thank you, Parthy. Thank you for having me.
So within our show, in the past year and a half, I've looked to explore themes of how our culture has been changing since not only our displacement from back home, but also in the post-war context. And one thing that has struck me, and I mean, I'm sure within all our community, is the role the dramatic arts and arts and culture in general has played and has continued to play a strong role. To give us an idea, historically, how has, in ancient Tamil times, arts, dramatic arts, music, culture played a role in the creation of identity?
Arts and cultures have always been extremely fluid in any linguistic group, and the Tamil cultural group is not an exception. And culture and expression have been fluid, as I said, but there have been several countercurrents running. So for example, if you look at the classical realm, they were supported by the court. So it was a very particular prescribed agenda that had to be manifested for the court, because the kings were funding and giving support for particular arts. But parallel traditions were always there, countercurrent traditions that were critical of the state, critical of the patronage. So artists have always been this interesting, how shall I say this, interesting mirror to society.
And this is in the ancient Chola times, Pandya Chera times, this phenomenon existed?
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. There were several currents circulating in terms of expression, and the artists, like in any community, in Tamil there's this beautiful word Nilai Kannadi. They hold up a mirror to society and show society what is happening. Sometimes it may not be favorable, but the artist always does that.
Right.
So it depends on patronage. Of course, in the Chola period, or even prior to Chola period, the arts were used for political propaganda.
Expression. Okay.
Yeah, expression and propaganda.
In a feudal society, how, in common understanding of feudal times, there was, the ruling family or the king had their way and wouldn't allow for any sort of resistance or opposition. How did that dynamic exist where the artists expressed dissent?
Well, dissent wasn't tolerated.
Okay.
So that's the bottom line.
Oh, right. Okay.
So if you're court funded, then of course you have an agenda to portray, and art, especially dance and theater, was in the service of the court.
Okay.
So the court set the agenda, the court set the tone, and art was used to propel the political dominance of that particular group. At the same time, there were voices of dissent.
Okay.
Because you can read it through the subtext, but those voices are not loud when you look at ancient history, because history, as you know very well, is written not by the voices of dissent, but the voices who have dominated the writing.
Right.
So it's interesting because history is writing itself is such a violent process because it is the victor's perspective that is written and then perpetuated throughout history. So I find it's interesting because it's not just that the people who are victorious write the history, but then the history that is perpetuated is also of the ruling strata.
And what were the themes, the major ideas that the artist expressed in the Chola times? What were the ideas?
Well, if we look specifically at the Chola period, then I can shed some light because, as you know, I don't teach anything past 10th century.
Okay.
So if we contain it within, 10th century, then I can shed some light. So in the Chola period, there was the court culture. So, for example, Rajaraja Cholan, had so many dancers on payroll. He had an inscription. The inscription is still there. Which dancer got what. The women had something like a retirement fund after they finished dancing at the temples and court. It was called Maniyam in Tamil.
All right.
So this particular dancer, Kuntavalli, received this amount of maniyam, land grants, all of that. Right. So they were on payroll.
Interesting.
And they had to perform services in the temple vis-a-vis the Brahminical temples as well as the court. But the repertoire that the dancers did at the temple and the court was different.
Okay.
They did not perform the same pieces, same urupadi they say in Tamil, the same pieces that they performed in the temple, they will not perform it in court.
And during that period, was music, dance, and dramatic art treated with equal weight, or was there certain preferences?
That's a good question because in a traditional theater format, dance was in service of theater. So an actor had to act, the actor had to dance, and the actor had to also sing.
Interesting.
So they were not separated. The artist had to do all three.
And as a result, did you have fewer artists, or was that the par? Like everyone
that was the standard.
That was the standard.
If we look at particularly the Chola period, the artists were of a particular class.
Interesting.
Not a particular caste, because in this South Asian landscape topography, caste and class are partners. But the artists were a particular class. They can be from different castes.
And was it spread out throughout the spectrum, or was it certain castes? Or
well, it depends on who they are interacting with.
Okay.
So there were different names for these groups. Isai Vallalar, different names at different periods, even within the Chola period. But the men and women who were in this particular artist class would have pedigree or heritage from different castes.
Okay, interesting.
But they all were in one class. They certainly didn't have, upwardly mobile status, but they were certainly interacting with men above that class and caste and lower also. But they certainly were a particular performing troupe caste.
And you mentioned men. Were they predominantly men, or was it a mixed?
The mix, because the men were the musicians, the singers, the Nattuvanars who were conducting the recitals. Men also performed in dance dramas in the Chola period, both classical, also running parallelly to the classical tradition. There were very many folk traditions. So the men were performing. But when we talk about the Devadasi tradition, which is a very specific strata of performers, the Devadasis were always women who were, and not all the girls, even within the Devadasi tradition, not all the girls were married off to the gods or the goddesses.
Right.
only certain girls were selected. To
How were
be-
these artists viewed by the general community, by the general society? Was there a healthy respect, or was there kind of, were they looked down upon, or what was the relationship?
Well, it's challenging to look back in history and have a general sort of sweeping statement. But my surmise would be mixed feelings. You know, they were certainly not upper class. They were performing class. But that doesn't mean that they didn't have respect in society. You know, that doesn't mean that the dancers wouldn't have influence over the king. They did. You know, that doesn't mean that one of them would be intimate as a courtesan who would really influence the king, which also happened. That doesn't mean that the upper class women will look down on them, and they did. So it is a mixed sort of what's the word, manifestation. So were they held up in esteem? Well, it depends on the period, even within Chola period and the time.
Okay.
So what I tell my upper division students is, when you look at history, you have to use two coordinates. You know, back in high school, we did microscope, and you looked at a slide of, you know, some culture or whatever, and we had two knobs in our microscope. So when we look at history, we have to use two knobs all the time to calibrate. And the first knob should be class and caste, social stratification. And then the second is a region, because it keeps changing.
Within ancient
within,
Tamil Nadu?
Oh, absolutely. And within which period? So it depends on the region. It depends on the social strata. The realities are not the same.
Interesting. In ancient times, how was the attendance of these dramatic arts in theater, music, and dance? Was it generally widely attended, or was it an elite group or a select group that actually partook in the performances? Or?
Well, it depends. As I said, you know, there was the certain performances were restricted for the court, sponsored by the king, and the temple festivals were sponsored by certain elite families. So it depends on where the performers are performing. At the same time, there are cross currents and folk traditions which are performed in the fields. Like the Kuthu tradition is running parallel to the classical Bharatanatyam tradition. And the Bharatanatyam tradition comes from folk traditions, earlier folk traditions. So there are multiple traditions. So if you ask me, are they well attended? I would say generally yes. But it depends where the performance is. Is it in court? Then of course, then it'll be just a court culture. It'll be elite court culture that is attending the performance and critiquing the performance and enjoying the performance. If it's a folk tradition, then it'll be another class and caste and region.
Can you shed more light on the Kuthu tradition? You know, for many second generation Tamil students in high school, university, and across the diaspora, the use of, you know, popular Ghana or Kuthu songs is very prevalent. Can you explain some of the history behind that?
Yeah, I'm not on sure footing because it's Kuthu, you know, the Ghana, Bollywood, Hollywood, you know, Tamil movie scene is beyond my scope.
Of course.
But I can shed some light on the Kuthu tradition because I do not know the connection between the Ghana Kuthu song.
But it has origins
and the Kuthu.
Presumably within Kuthu.
Yes, I don't know.
Okay.
But the Kuthu tradition, which is being performed today in Toronto, within the Tamil community and also in Sri Lanka and South India, is very interesting because it's a folk tradition. I've seen Kuthu performed over 14 nights in South India, close to Tirunelveli district. So it is performed at night. The Kuthu performance is outdoors. It's performed in a circular performance area. In Tamil, it's called Vattakalari. Not proscenium stage like in Markham Theatre or some theatre where the audience is in front of you. But the audience is in the round, which is more challenging for the performer because you have to perform in all angles. And also, even today in Kuthu tradition, the actor has to dance, the actor has to sing, and the actor has to act. So the skill level is certainly higher because they have to be good in all three. If not, the audience will comment even during a performance. So it's very interactive. A Kuthu tradition is very interactive and very what's the word? Improvisation happens instantly because they are reacting to the audience's feelings. Maybe the musician is making some interesting move or change in the tune. So Kuthu is a very live tradition. It is not scripted like a Bharatanatyam performance. Perfect Jadiswaram practiced for so many years. Come and you perform.
In many Tamil works, there's always the intersection between religion, like Saiva Hinduism, and culture, Tamil culture, the linguistic aspect. And how has that manifested itself in theater, music, and dance, that intersection of religion and culture?
Well, my perspective, which is shared by many, religion was used, or the arts was used to propagate religion. So it doesn't matter what the ideology is. It can be the political ideology of a Chola dynasty, or a particular Chola king, political agenda, or the religious agenda, or a political ideology. The arts has always been in service to some ideology. So in that light, I don't see religion as something different.
Right.
The arts was used to propagate religion. And my question is, why religion? Because it served the court. Religion was a very effective tool to control your population, control the masses. Religion was in service of the court. And court used any propaganda because it's TVI where we are, and it was the media of the day. Dance and theater was the media. That's the best way to change and modulate and control public minds.
So is it fair to say that the temples were in service to the king?
Absolutely. Absolutely, especially starting from Pallava period. So we're looking at South India, Pallava period onwards. There's this process that we use today in history, religion, and the arts called Sanskritization. So Sanskritization is a process, is a very definite process. It is a deliberate process. It's a constructed process of control that the court has set in motion. So the temples were in service of the court.
And how did that process, it's something within Tamil nationalist circles you hear of the Sanskritization process. What propagated that? What created that impulse for Tamil kings to adopt Sanskrit in the temple use?
Well, it just comes down to, ground level. It's about control and class and caste.
So why use Sanskrit as opposed to continue or conducting religious worship in Tamil?
Because Sanskrit has this historical, braiding, like or pinnal jadai mari, right? It has that braiding of caste and class. So from very early on, Sanskrit politically has been upheld as the religious language. For me, I ask my students who are 20-year-old students, what language do you pray in? And the response from them is, well, they think, okay, he's asking me, he's Tamil, I better tell him, I pray in Tamil. And I'm like, really? If you're failing your exam, if your best friend or your girlfriend or boyfriend is an accident, what is that instant prayer? Oh God, help him. What language do you pray in? It's English. For the Canadian kids. I was in Berlin in June. I was with all these 20-year-old young Tamil Berliners. Yeah. And I said, what language do you pray in? German. So, the language of intimacy with divinity is what you understand.
Okay.
But Sanskrit was always elevated as this language that only used for Brahminical ritual.
So before we go to break, sorry to interrupt. It's an important question. Before that introduction of the Sanskritization, was temple use in Tamil?
No.
Okay.
When you say temple use, if you refer to agamic temples, Brahminical agamic temples. The first period that you get temple construction is Pallava period, prior to Chola. That is when you get the first stone temples.
And prior to that, was it in the south? What was the worship
It would have been in local dialects, Tamil, whatever the local dialects is.
With different deities?
Yes, there would have been different deities.
Okay. It's time for a short break, dear viewers. Please join us after these short announcements. Welcome back to Crossroads on TVI. I'm Parthi Kandavo. Today we're discussing the role of arts and culture within our community. We're joined with Professor Sudarshan Durayappa, a professor of ancient history and religion at the University of Toronto. Dear viewers, please join our conversation by calling us at 416-623-8100. We'd love to hear your thoughts and opinions. Professor Durayappa, before the break, we're discussing the role of Sanskrit within our temples, and I just wanted to tie that topic up by what was the impetus for Tamil kings in that ancient times to go from a Tamil language-based religious setup to adopting Sanskrit, and I'm assuming here with that the caste system.
Yeah, I mean, again, getting back to Chola, which which is the period that we are looking at under a microscope. The Pallava period and the Chola period, the kings were from the north, so they came with a Sanskrit tradition already. The conquerors of that region were not southern. They were from the north. Southern part of Orissa today, we would say. So they came with a very strong Sanskritic tradition. And Sanskrit tradition is embedded in caste and class. So the rulers are interested in, always are, even today, the state is interested in controlling its citizens. And the best way to control the citizens, Kudimakkal, right? Your regular people, is religion. Religion is such an effective tool to use, to control, to propel an ideology. So Sanskrit, before even the early Pallava period, it's already there. The Rig Veda is dated not in writing but in oral tradition, dated back to 1500 BC.
So in pre-Sanskrit times, was there social stratification like caste within the Tamil regions?
I don't know.
Okay, I guess we're going back really far, right? So to actually,
I assume yes, because we are human, and human. There was never a period in human history that I know of, not that I know a lot, but I know of where everybody was equal. There was no egalitarian system. There was always some social stratification. And I say this because I teach a course on Indus Valley. That is the first four curriculum links. And in Indus Valley, it's already very clear. So Indus Valley civilization, Mohenjo-daro, Harappa culture is 4,600 years ago. And they are contemporary with ancient China, Mesopotamia, and Egypt and Africa. And Indus Valley, already when you see it, the material culture and architecture of Mohenjo-daro and Harappa, it is very clear that social stratification existed.
Okay. It's interesting. So they just adopted it.
Correct. But because even if you look at the urban planning of Harappa and Mohenjo-daro, there are streets that were only for certain craftsmen. There was it was demarked according to your job.
To fast forward thousands of years and to bring our conversation to present or contemporary times, Back home, how was the arts and culture scene pre-war? Was there a healthy space and a room for Tamil artists to create and flourish in the post-independence pre-war time?
You're talking about the
in Sri Lanka.
Okay, the recent history.
Yeah,
I assume so. I'm not an expert, of that particular period or the region.
Right.
But I did grow up in Jaffna. We came here in 85. 1985 is when we came. So I only know of what that particular period prior to 1985.
Yeah.
And yes, but what it was interesting now when you ask me, Parthy, is that it existed, these countercurrents existed all the time. So in Jaffna, there was the Bharatanatyam scene. There was the regular Arangetams, Veerasingham Hall, temple performances, but it was caste marked.
Right.
It was either Vallala dominant, because in Sri Lanka, the Brahmins are not that powerful. They are usually in service of some Vallala community. But the art scene was controlled. So the classical music, classical dance scene was controlled.
Was there a strong theater scene?
Yes, but then again, it depends on where the theater is. If it's a folk theater in the villages, then some particular social dominant caste would be controlling it. If it's the Veerasingham Hall, then certainly no Dalit performances that I know of were ever performed in the Veerasingham Hall in my period, 85 before.
And in terms of during that period in the 70s, what were the themes of the productions? What was being discussed? What was being performed?
Very exciting because it was both. It was the classical themes, Bharatanatyam, gods and goddesses and forever.
Yeah.
And then there was the contemporary theatre. There was an actual contemporary theatre which was, like I said earlier, Nilai Kannadi. It showed the society, what was happening in society, reflected back.
And these were critical pieces?
Oh yes, very critical pieces.
Okay.
And then also from Batikulo, you might have heard of Maunaguru, who was reworking Kuthu traditions. He was reclaiming and reworking Kuthu traditions, and he would come to Toronto, come to Jaffna, and do theatre workshops. So there were Pudiyathoru Veedu, very exciting, contemporary, politically critical theatre work.
Interesting.
So as I said earlier, there were these both currents. There was a classical realm happening, servicing a particular social class strata, and then contemporary work happening, critical of dominant.
Was there any opposition from larger society, from the dominant classes, against the critical pieces?
I'm sure there is.
There was.
I'm sure there were, and I'm sure there is even today. So yes, because which class and caste wants to give up their power and privilege? Nobody does.
How was the impact of the war on the Tamil theatre, music, and dance scenes? I mean, there obviously was an impact, but in terms of the themes and the ideas and the expressions.
Yes, I do not know. And I'm not comfortable even taking a stab at it literally after the war, but because I don't know.
I guess bringing our discussion to the diaspora, which you've been very involved with in terms of theater performances and dance productions. How has the community evolved, let's say, post 1990 in Toronto?
Very interestingly, I mean, looking back, especially in dance theatre in the Sri Lankan Tamil community in Toronto, again, very specific, region specific, and period specific. Very interestingly, well, of course, there's the fossilized Bharatanatyam scene. The dancers are still doing the Arangetams and that sort of thing, and containing it in a very particular way, and articulating it and then marking it in a particular way. That's still happening. But also the contemporary theatre scene is very live. I mean, there's this wonderful theatre group called Manavali that has been performing for 16 years. They have annually done shows, contemporary Tamil theatre in Tamil theatre for 16 years, and they have a show actually next Sunday at Markham Theatre. 2 shows, 1 o'clock and 6 o'clock. And this theatre group has been around for 16 years. I mean, that is impressive in Toronto.
For 16 years.
For 16 years.
And what are some of the themes that Manavelli has addressed?
Usually Manavelli will request a script from a director, from a writer. The script is vetted, heavily vetted and scrutinized, and then they would select certain directors to work with those scripts. The theme range from diasporic concerns to concerns of Sri Lanka, concerns of mass migration to Denmark, wherever the Tamil diaspora has set up. But this year's theme, Arangadal, which is on Sunday, Markham Theatre, this Sunday, October 13th, the theme is post-war.
Interesting.
So post-war feelings, memory erasures, frictions of post-war feelings. And there are 4 plays. The first play is a very interesting play. I'm sure the next segment is with Sudarshi, who is a performer, and she can bring a very intimate lens to the performances and the plays, and she will, I'm sure, shed some light.
How does plays and productions on post-war realities, whether it's a set back home or set in the diaspora, how does drama and the arts play a role in rehabilitation and in coming to terms with what happened?
I think it's a powerful tool. I think the arts is a powerful tool, whether it's in the service of the king, or whether it's service of Brahminical Hinduism, or whether it's in service of another agenda. It's a powerful, effective tool. It's a media that you can use. So you can certainly use it to recognize certain feelings. You can, art therapy is very important. But in this context, it tells a particular audience, the diasporic audience, certain social features that might be uncomfortable, because it's looking in, right? Right? It's inward looking at a community. So some of the stuff might be uncomfortable, but it has to be said by an artist.
In contrast to these ideas and themes, what I've seen and what we've addressed on the show many times is, since post-09, since the post-war, we've seen the heavy influx of artists and musicians from Tamil Nadu coming in, putting on shows. And, many of the themes, they're very mainstream stuff that don't address post-war realities or are critical on our society. Is that a healthy balance, or is it weighted more in one direction?
See, I'm not I do not know how to comment.
Okay.
But what I do know is, every home, or at least most of the homes that I visited, and even my family and my cousins have, JRTV and, Sun TV and Vijay TV. And it brings in a very narrow perspective of what Tamil culture is. It did exist in Sri Lanka also. SLBC, Sri Lankan Broadcasting Corporation, pumped out a very specific identity of Tamil. The SLBC actors all had to speak in this very constructed Tamil Vallala accent. So that was considered good theatre if you spoke in Vallala accent. And the same thing happened in the BBC. The BBC accent is a constructed English accent. Upper class, polished, posh accent. But nobody in England speaks like the BBC. It's a constructed accent, which Sri Lankan Broadcasting Corporation did it. So what I'm saying is nothing has changed. It's like a kaleidoscope. The patterns are changing, but the colors, the hues are the same.
What are the risks of running when our second generation and even now third generation, second and 2.5 and third generations are exposed to Tamil culture through this narrow lens of Vijay TV and, Tamil Nadu productions? What's the risk we're running?
Well, I don't know, because I study ancient history and religion. We only study after it's finished. We're not studying it as it's happening, right? So I just have to wait and see. Maybe a young PhD will look at it 10 years from now and say, oh, this is what happened. But it's so fluid. But what I do know is the contemporary productions of theatre are far ahead than the contemporary dance scene in Toronto.
Okay.
Because the contemporary dance scene hasn't advanced as much as the theatre has, or the literary genres have. Dance is very stagnated. Pintangi, thirkunilela dhaan irukkudu. It's like really stagnant. And that is my lament. That is my opinion. That it hasn't moved forward like the theatre has or the literary worlds have.
There's a film production that was recently released, A Gun and a Ring. And in that production, we saw artists from Toronto, Tamil artists from Toronto, work with artists from France, I believe, as well. Do we see that same dynamic in theatre productions where local artists have worked with writers, directors, other actors from Tamils from other diaspora lands, or even from artists who are situated back home?
They have. There's always this fluidity, right? I mean, the word transnational relates to the arts as well. So even in Sri Lanka, the artists would go to India or Malaysia. Malaysian artists would come to Jaffna even, back in the day. And nothing has changed in Toronto. So the Toronto artists, yes, are going to India for training. Indian directors are brought for, productions. English directors, English Tamil directors are brought. I mean, the art scene is very transnational.
Okay.
An Arangetam can have a singer from Germany,
right,
who is coming to sing, and he brings a particular aesthetic, a particular a particular injection into the art scene.
Have there been any productions with artists from the Northeast?
In terms of them
whether
coming?
they're coming here or their works being performed here?
Not that I'm aware. That doesn't mean that.
Do you think
that
with
it
time
has.
that, and as the barriers lessen?
Oh, I'm sure.
Okay.
I'm sure. But there have been artists who have gone to Sri Lanka to work. So I was there last December in Batticaloa, and I worked with Mauna Guru. I did a workshop for Mauna Guru theatre group, as also for Jay Shankar, who is the head of the fine arts department at the Eastern University in Batticaloa. I did a workshop for him, and then Mauna Guru sir wanted me to do a workshop for only the Bharatanatyam degree students.
In the Eastern University.
So there is exchange, and every time Mauna Guru sir comes to Toronto, we organize a workshop for him, or even Mangay, who comes from India, Chennai. Mangay has done workshops here in Toronto that we have organized. One workshop was only for female actors and directors. So it was a closed interaction. So there's always been this cross current.
Okay.
Correct.
Thank you, Sudarshan. Unfortunately, it's time for another break.
Okay.
Dear viewers, please join us again after these short announcements. Welcome back, dear viewers. Today on CrossRoads, we've been discussing the arts and culture both historically and contemporary in our Tamil community. We're joined in this segment with Sudarshi Ignatius, who'll be shedding her light as a performer and as an actor and as a very multi-talented person in our community. Welcome. Thank you for making the time, Sudarshi, and joining Sudarshan and myself. You've been very active within the Tamil community, and I was curious to how you came to find yourself in the theater community, the dance community within our community.
For me, even when I was back home, when I going to school, I did a lot of stage dramas. So that was of my interest. That was kind of in me. But then after coming here, building a new life as an immigrant, as a struggle itself. So I couldn't really spend much time. And then after university, I got involved with media, so kind of went off the tangent for a bit. But I kind of knew about Manavali Arankadal, and I know that they have established name in the community, and I really, that professionalism is there. And I also heard about the process. It's a long process, and they go through so many scripts for plays, and a very critical selection and the preparation that puts into it. So I kind of had a good image about Arankadal, and it was one of my interests for some time when I get time to get back into this theater work. Unfortunately, now it's the time because I live in Stratford actually. I don't live in Scarborough. So since August, I didn't start early. I didn't join Arankadal very early. But since August, I've been driving about 2 hours from Stratford every Sunday for rehearsals. Because I moved to Stratford, I couldn't get involved in a lot of activities that I used to do before. Yes, so that freed up some time for me. So I said, okay, this is the time to sort of get back into theater work. And for me, acting and with Arankadal, what I like about this more contemporary work, and they're more current. Even for example, that play that I'm doing right now, I'm part of Kuthu. The Kuthu is a reflection. It actually portrays violence in a society, in a community, in a country, and violence in many forms. Violence can come from the ruling party. Violence can come from people in a higher status in a society, that dominant.
Right.
The oppression can come from male dominant, right? Or it's saying very territorialized, saying this is my territory and it only belongs to me. So the violence can take a lot of forms, and that resonates a lot with how I feel, and I could relate back to my identity.
Why do you think it's important to talk about these topics within our in our productions?
It's one is like for me personally, it's the identity issues, right? And sense of belonging. It gives me a space in the society. A sense of belonging. It's about I'm connecting back to who I am. Okay, that's from the identity perspective, and this, again, the sense of belonging and all that. And the other thing is, it's passing down to our generations to come, because when you talk about your culture, your heritage, you don't just celebrate the positive things. It's very important we also know about some of the struggles that went on in the past, and it's very, very important, right? So place like this, it's important that we support these places like the local artists. It's important to support them because it's an educational tool, pretty much.
Exactly.
Arts, it can create a vibrant society, and it could challenge a lot of social norms. It could teach about some of the struggles in the history, and arts keeps the cultural values at the core completely, and I believe in it so much.
Certainly. Do you find other young people such as yourself coming to partake and be involved?
Yes, in Kuthu, we have one young Lavenda, her name is, and she's doing a small piece. It's quite interesting. I always think of her because she's doing her degree in music right now at the university. And I see that that's a progress, speaking of arts and culture within our community, that mindset of you only have to become a doctor, you only have to become a lawyer, that kind of change, and the parents are kind of supporting it. And she is taking part in it. And speaking of embracing more young people, that's sort of the mission of Arankadal or Manavali Arankadal. What they're saying, going forward, if they're young artists, young directors, if they want to direct play in English, they're more than willing to accept those submissions.
Interesting. And Sudarshan, have you've mentioned earlier in our discussion about what language you think or pray in that case. Has there been, majority of Manavali's productions have been in Tamil. Is there an appetite for English language plays that reflect Tamil identity and Tamil?
Oh, I'm sure.
Questions?
Yes, I'm sure. And Arankadal is open, as Sudarshi said, for productions either in English or bilingually Tamil English, or even Tamil French for that matter. productions. And in terms of this year's Arangadal, what Arangadal is doing, which is very welcoming and commendable, is they have created a choreographic lab. So I'm the coordinator for the choreographic lab. It's a 2-year commitment. And we have brought in 2 young choreographers, Aishwarya Chandru and Kiran, who are working with directors, but they are both pulling their Bharatanatyam vocabulary, stretching it in a contemporary sense. So their objective as choreographers is to use their classical training, but the work cannot look classical. And it has to look contemporary because the directors are very specific. And then next year, Arangadal, which is 2014 rather, Arangadal will give these 2 young choreographers, Aishwarya Chandru and Kiran, a platform to bring contemporary dance, which is wonderful because contemporary dance scene is always lacking behind. Literary work, theatre works, and dance is just not caught on.
Sudarshan, can you tell us how has the reception been in the community for these type of productions?
To be quite honest, maybe if you go back several years back, I remember people saying Arangadal it's boring because it's a traditional approach, right? But that is changing now. See, in this today, the performance that's going to happen next Sunday, the themes are more current.
Okay.
Right, the themes are more current, and also the language is more current. It's more can be understood. Like even in Kuthu, the scripts is modified in a way that it can be understood by a lay person. It's not a very hardcore Tamil that's used in that script. So that perception, I believe it's changing. It's changing because we are. I mean, that has to be. That's the other thing. Perhaps the artists and performers should keep in mind. Sort of be able to let go some of our ways that we used to practice. In that very traditional approach, and be able to appeal to the current issues and current population, the audience, right? So that is changing. Yeah, and so I think that the reception it's quite more.
That these theater groups take, Emmanuel in this case, take the feedback from the audience and incorporate that. Going back to the past a bit, in the 90s, there was a common occurrence of programs, where groups, whether they were from a certain village or a certain old boys association, had productions, and there were a lot of theater style performances mixed with dance, singing, and whatnot. However, we don't see that same continuation now in 2013. And why do you think what has happened to that sense of community through these programs, events we used to have? Why?
What kind of program?
Like, before they used to be, high schools in Scarborough were rented out and there were these programs put on. But we don't see that same phenomenon anymore.
More of a cultural program?
Yeah, the cultural shows, programs.
I think that's my opinion again. That's kind of taken away by more of Indian artists. I see that more. Now you're right, more musical shows that's happening and where Indian artists are being brought to Toronto. You're right, but I guess it's a trend that's happening. I don't have much to say. Do you have anything to add to that?
Not specifically, but you do see a cultural valence, a cultural cachet. If it's an Indian production, so if the Rogers Centre is rented for an Indian music director to bring in some actors, but that is directly connected to the Vijay TV coming to your living room or Sun TV coming to your living room. It is just an extension because the bottom line is economics. So it's huge productions. It's multi-million-dollar productions. So yes, it is certainly dominant. But as I said earlier, there's this very powerful countercurrent voice in the theatre scene. So yes, you have these large productions with Ilayaraja and whomever, but then there's Manavali for 16 years that has been successfully putting plays critical about societal issues, concerns in a very artistic format. And if I may go back earlier to one of your comments about how is the community brought in, what Manavali does every year is after the performances are done, after Arangadal is finished, they offer a Vimarsana Kootam, which is a feedback open to the community. So all the artists will be sitting, the performers, directors, choreographers and dancers, and the audience comes in, anybody from the society, from community can come and say, Sudarshan, why was this done? This wasn't clear. What was your idea in this? So this way the artists are also growing and the audience is also mutually elevating the artist, and then theirs is coming together. And I only know of Arangadal who does that, who brings in the community after every performance.
One final question before we wrap up is, how can we as a community, I feel music and dance have, rightfully or wrongly, have been very strongly supported. How can we promote dramatic arts, the theater, within our second generation?
One is, as I said, the sort of letting go this, holding on to some core values. For example, in Kuthu, the director wanted to have everything, like the performance accompanied by live music. Nothing is recorded. So he wanted to have that core essence element in it. But again, modifying it a little bit so that it appeals to the current generation, right? Have that destructive, creative idea. So you let go of some, but you hold on to some and you gain more, right?
So how can you promote acting, theater acting within the second generation?
Yeah, and dance for that matter. So I see it as a three-pronged approach, three separate approaches all at the same time. So the first approach is the Canadian government has to fund the arts. Curriculum, arts has to be brought into the curriculum. The second, the parents have to think of non-traditional professions, as Sudarshi has said. And the third approach is the young generation has to feel that they want to do an art project or involve in the arts. So I see it as a three-pronged approach. The state has to support it, the family home has to support it, and also the individual has to be propelled to do the arts.
Unfortunately, time's up, but thank you very much, Sudarshi and Sudarshan, for coming on our show and having this discussion. Dear viewers, please join us next week for Crossroads on TVI. Have a good week.
தமிழரின் பிம்பம் உங்கள் டிவி.